Okay, so we're in chapter 26, all about the Cold War. Section 4 specifically is about Cold War conflicts. And we're going to start with Korea. Although the US and the Soviet Union never went to war directly with one another, the Cold War tensions provoked conflicts in other parts of the world. Both superpowers, the US and the USSR, competed for the loyalty and resources of the world's less developed nations. This competition fueled civil wars and other violent struggles. The fiercest fighting took place in Korea and Vietnam, but conflicts also ended up erupting in Latin America, the Middle East, and Africa. So we're going to start learning about Korea. The first major battle of the Cold War took place in Korea. The Korean War lasted from 1950 to 53 and nearly caused a wider war. Some of you guys may have grandparents that fought in the Korean War. At the end of World War II, Korea was liberated from Japanese control and divided in half, as you can see there on your screen at the 38th parallel. The Soviet Union occupied the northern half, while the U.S. occupied the south. By 1949, both countries had withdrawn their forces, but Korea remained divided between the communist north and non-communist south. In June of 1950, North Korea ends up invading the south with Soviet and Chinese backing. The U.S. responded by immediately sending troops to defend South Korea. South Korea also happens to be capitalist or democratic, so they're wanting to protect that as well. It also gained support from the United Nations, which called on member states to form a UN army to repel the invasion. At first, it appeared that North Korea would defeat the UN army, but General Douglas MacArthur, the UN commander, managed to encircle and isolate the North Korean forces. He then moved north all the way to the Chinese border at the Yalu River. To prevent a UN victory, China got involved. It sent 300,000 troops into North Korea and pushed the UN forces back. MacArthur called for airstrikes against China, possibly with nuclear weapons. President Truman rejected the idea, fearing it could draw the Soviet Union into the war if they chose to use those bombs. And they didn't want to draw the Soviet Union into the war because, guess what, guys? They also had nukes. Eventually, the fighting reached an impasse. North and South Korea returned to their 1949 borders and signed an armistice, or an end to the fighting. So Korea becomes divided into a communist north and non-communist south because at the end of World War II, that's just where they were divided. The Soviet Union occupied the north and the U.S. occupied the south. Remember, Japan was on the Axis powers, and since they had control of Korea, they lost the war. Part of their surrender was giving up land that they had conquered, and Korea was one of those. So the Korean War ends essentially in a stalemate. Both after North Korea invades the South, I should say, let's back up for a minute. June 1950, North Korea invades the South. The Soviet Union and China are backing them up. The U.S. responds. And then ultimately it ends in a stalemate, and they stay at that border, that line, 38th parallel, that was set at the end of World War II. For a time, the Korean conflict had raised the threat of a nuclear war between the superpowers. Instead, it ended in a stalemate. Today, Korea remains divided. South Korea has prospered as a capitalist and democratic state. North Korea, on the other hand, is a strict communist dictatorship. Relations between the two Koreas remain tense. Just the other day, guys, there was a press release that came out from South Korea that North Korea had launched an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile, into this right here, the Sea of Japan. So things are still very active between North and South Korea. And we actually still have troops stationed at an military base in general in South Korea. I have family that at one point they were stationed in South Korea. So here's some images from the Korean War. You can see there. That's a good primary source for you. You can see several warheads right here. Now, those aren't not nuclear warheads, but they are bombs nonetheless. Okay, so now we're going to move into the Vietnam War. The next major conflict arose in Vietnam. It began as an anti-colonial fight for independence against France because Vietnam was once part of French Indochina, but it soon became a Cold War struggle between communist and non-communist forces. At the end of World War II, Vietnam was still part of the French colony of Indochina. After the war, Vietnamese nationalists, led by the communist leader Ho Chi Minh, declared independence. For 8 years, French and Vietnamese forces battled in the Indochina War. In 1954, the French were defeated. Vietnam was divided into a communist north, again backed by China and the Soviet Union, and an anti-communist south, backed by, no surprise, the United States. Within a few years, communist-led rebels known as the Viet Cong rose up against the Southern government. The Vietnam War was about to begin. The U.S. actually entered the war in stages. At first, it provided South Vietnam with military aid and assistance, including military advisors, not really troops though. These advisors trained the South Vietnamese army and also took part in combat. By late 1963, some 17,000 U.S. advisors were on the ground in Vietnam. So, we're starting to see a little bit more military involvement. In 1964, after reports of an attack on a U.S. ship off the North Vietnamese coast, President Lyndon Johnson called for an escalation of U.S. involvement. He argued that the U.S. had a duty to defend South Vietnam from communist aggression. He said, "If we are driven from the field in Vietnam, then no nation can ever have the same confidence in American protection." If Vietnam fell to communism, he said, other Asian nations might also fall. This idea became known as the domino theory. So his thought process was, if Vietnam falls to communism, so too will Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, etc., etc. And it all just happens like you push one domino over and the rest follow. So as far as how the superpowers became involved in Vietnam, Vietnam's divided. The North backed by China and the Soviet Union, an anti-communist South backed by the U.S. Viet Cong rises up against the Southern government trying to take over, and the U.S. becomes more involved relatively gradually. In early of 1965, the U.S. carried out airstrikes against targets in North Vietnam. Soon after, it sent its first combat troops into Vietnam. Over the next 2 years, U.S. forces in the country increased rapidly. By 1969, more than 500,000 American soldiers were serving in Vietnam. The U.S. dedicated vast military resources to the war effort, yet despite its superior firepower, it could not achieve victory. The U.S. government faced mounting opposition at home and abroad to its war in Vietnam. And to put that in a little bit more specific detail for you guys, there was a draft invoked for the Vietnam War in the United States, and soldiers were people that were drafted were burning their draft cards, which is a federal offense. And so they were supposed to go to prison for that. People did not want to fight in this Vietnam War. Think about it. You have World War I in the 19-teens, World War II in the 1940s, Korean War in the 1950s, and now the Vietnam War in the 1960s. Americans are sick and tired of war, especially when they don't see it protecting the United States at all. That was not the perspective of people at home, even though that was the perspective of the government of the United States. So that's the U.S. side of it, facing mounting opposition at home, and also troops would come back from Vietnam, and people just walking down the street would like throw things at them, spit at them. So now we think of the idea that we have to honor the people who sacrifice their livelihoods for our country, but back then it didn't matter if you were a military member and you had fought for your country in Vietnam. You were still disrespected, and we see that still today. We are now respectful to Vietnam veterans, and it means so much to them because that's not the homecoming that they had when they initially came home from the war. However, the Viet Cong, they were really committed to fight to their last resources to drive the Americans out of Vietnam. By the early 1970s, the U.S. had begun to pull its troops out and shift responsibility to the Army of South Vietnam. So then finally, in 1973, the last American soldiers left Vietnam. Within 3 years, North Vietnam had conquered the South and united the country. Many Southerners fled communist rule. Most made their way to refugee camps in other parts of Southeast Asia and later to the U.S. Like China, Vietnam eventually adopted reforms and opened up its economy. Communist officials continued to retain a tight grip on the government. And I believe I'm pretty positive Vietnam is still communist today. So moving down now to Latin America, we're going to talk a little bit about Fidel Castro. And you guys might have heard about him on the news relatively recently. He just passed away. His brother, I believe it's his brother, is in control of Cuba now. So Latin America also became a battleground in the Cold War. Widespread poverty and sharp divisions among social classes made the region ripe for political upheaval. As in other parts of the world, communists promoted class struggle in Latin America as a means to achieve social justice and diminish economic inequalities. The U.S., which had long dominated the hemisphere, remained alert to the growth of communism in the Western Hemisphere. The first Cold War incident in Latin America occurred in Guatemala. In 1953, a nationalist president, Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, began a program of land reform. He took unused land from the American-owned United Fruit Company and gave it to poor peasants. Arbenz was not a communist, but he did have communist support. A year later, the U.S. staged a covert action, I believe through the CIA, to oust Arbenz and replace him with a military dictator. The Guatemalan army held power for most of the next 3 decades, so till the 80s, I would say. In Cuba, a revolution led by Fidel Castro overthrew the nation's U.S.-supported dictator Fulgencio Batista in 1959. Castro sided with the poor against Cuba's wealthy middle and upper classes. He soon declared his communist sympathies and made Cuba a Soviet ally. The U.S. responded with efforts to remove Castro from power, including a failed invasion at Cuba's Bay of Pigs in 1961. Cold War tensions with Cuba reached their height in October of 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Castro had allowed the Soviet Union to install nuclear missiles in Cuba within striking distance of American cities. This was a really scary time for people. If you ask anybody that was alive during this time period, they were scared. Castro had allowed the Soviet Union, again, to install these nuclear missiles. You can see pictures here. The U.S. sent some cameras over and discovered this, what you see here on your screen. The U.S. placed a naval blockade around the island of Cuba and demanded that the Soviets remove the missiles. Keep in mind that Cuba is only 90 miles away from Miami, like the border or the Florida Keys, I guess, would be more accurate. So 90 miles, that's like from here, I think, to just a little bit west of Jamestown. So that's pretty close. It also considered a possible invasion of Cuba. For 2 anxious weeks, the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war. Eventually, the Soviets backed down and withdrew the missiles in return for a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba. For the next few decades, Cuba remained a source of Cold War frictions. The U.S. accused Castro of promoting revolution in the Americas. To halt the spread of communism, the U.S. used covert methods to oppose leftist influence. For example, the U.S. helped overthrow a democratically elected socialist government of Chile in 1973. I believe all of these overthrows happened with the use of CIA operatives. A brutal military dictatorship ruled Chile for the next 2 decades. A revolution in Nicaragua also aroused American concerns. Leftist rebels known as the Sandinistas toppled a U.S.-backed dictatorship in 1979. The Sandinistas' ties to Cuba and aid to rebels in neighboring El Salvador soon sparked conflict with the U.S. The U.S. began funding a rebel army called the Contras to fight the Sandinistas in 1981. The Contra War inflicted great damage and undermined Sandinista rule. In 1990, the Sandinistas lost power through elections. So to finish off this chapter, we're going to start another video. And this video will be mostly section 5, but we do have a couple of things to discuss regarding the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa. So check out the next video for that. But basically for Cuba, we see a revolution. Cuba draws the U.S. and Soviet Union into conflict because Fidel Castro overthrows the U.S.-supported government. He allies with the Soviet Union, which scares the whatever out of the U.S. because, again, Cuba is 90 miles off the coast of the U.S. And so that was a very scary event for them. Not to mention later on, the U.S., they start to kind of surveil Cuba and they discover nuclear missiles in Cuba within striking distance of U.S. cities. So that was probably the longest 2 weeks of many Americans' lives.